Hi, I'm Kris Newby. I'm the author of Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. Uh, um, just by way of background, I am a science writer by profession. I'm an engineer by training. I have 2 engineering degrees. I got a master's from Stanford. I went through the program that's the predecessor to what's called design school or D school in Stanford. So I like to think that methodology taught me how to solve complex problems. Um, I, um, I guess my life changed radically when my husband and I took our family to Martha's Vineyard for a family vacation, and Paul and I came back with a really bad case of Lyme and babesiosis, which you just heard about. It's nasty. It took, back in California, I live in Palo Alto, it took us a year, 10 doctors, and $60,000 to get diagnosed with those 2 diseases. And it took us 5 to 6 years to fully recover. While I was recovering, I realized how the misinformation on this disease was a huge impediment to moving forward. So I started a Lyme disease documentary with Andy Abrahams-Wilson, a really talented filmmaker in Marin. And together we crisscrossed the nation for 3.5 years and filmed experts and Lyme patients. Many of you we filmed are in this room. So I have a 10-year relationship with those people. And during that process, what I realized is that this Lyme disease, tick-borne disease problem is just enormous, and it's nationwide. And so at a certain point I said, I guess I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to fixing this problem like a true engineer. And after the film, which was exhausting, the documentary, it's called Under Our Skin, it did really well. It won 20 documentary awards, and it was an Oscar semifinalist in 2010, which is pretty good for a feature-length film with suffering. And after that, I was really tired, and I told my husband, Paul, okay, I am done with Lyme. I'm going to pass the torch to others, like the LivLyme people. I'm better now. I had a really good job at Stanford. I'm moving on. And then just a couple weeks later, one of my indie filmmaker friends sent me a documentary with Willy Bergdorfer. First of all, I wanted to plant 2 questions at the back of your mind as you watch this slideshow. And in this slideshow, my book, Bitten, has really 3 storylines. Primarily, it's the biography of Willy Bergdorfer, who discovered Lyme disease. A secondary storyline is the Cold War bioweapons program that Willy was part of. And the third storyline is my journey as a Lyme patient and my understanding of the politics of the disease and the flaws in the scientific system. So the 2 questions I want to put in the back of your mind before I go forward are, in 1968, there were 2 crazy outbreaks of what we now call Lyme disease. One was centered around Long Island Sound, so that's Lyme, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. And the other one was started sort of in Minneapolis area in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the first case. So the question is why? Why does this really virulent new strain of Borrelia show up around 1968, or at least we noticed it then? Why? And then my book really focuses on the outbreak around Lyme, Connecticut. I'll leave Wisconsin for another book. But it's really unusual that there were 3 freaky new tick-borne diseases that showed up around the late 60s within really, maybe 100 square miles, which is nothing for a bird. So the diseases were Rocky Mountain spotted fever and a version of spotted fever that's a little anomalous, this thing we called Lyme arthritis then, and then babesiosis. So as you've heard today, Lyme arthritis is caused by a spirochete. Spotted fever is caused by a rickettsia, which people thought until recently was a virus. It's very small and it behaves a lot like a virus. It has to live inside of living cells, and it explodes the cells and then goes on to wreak havoc. And then Babesia, and Babesia before the late 60s was only a cattle-borne disease, and somehow it crossed into humans in the 60s. And the case on, I think, Nantucket was the first one, and it was the second one in the US. The first one was in Colorado, and it was the fifth in the world. So highly, highly unusual. So, you know, if you're a person who, like from CDC, from the Investigative Intelligence Service, you would look at that and say, this is highly unusual, and I would look at it to see if it's a natural or an unnatural outbreak. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to just go really quickly through the public story of Lyme disease and the Lyme disease discoverer, which is Willy Burgdorfer. So this is Willy Burgdorfer working on soft-body ticks in 1951 when he first started working at the Rocky Mountain Lab. And he came from Switzerland. He was a medical zoologist who specialized in soft-body ticks and relapsing fever. For mostly his Geigy was his mentor at the Swiss Tropical Institute. He was from the wealthy pharmaceutical company, which is now called Ciba Geigy, and they invented DDT. So Rocky Mountain Lab is on the western edge of Montana. It was founded originally to investigate Rocky Mountain spotted fever, that rickettsia I showed you. It, at the time, was the most deadly tick-borne disease we knew of. And the lab grew and was the leading center for researching tick-borne diseases in the US. And they also manufactured yellow fever vaccines for the war effort in World War II. You can see them growing them in eggs because viruses like rickettsia have to grow in live cells, and fertilized eggs are live cells, so that's how they mass produce them until better methods were developed. So Willie comes over 51, 52. He falls in love with Hamilton, Montana, which is surrounded by mountains. It looks just like Switzerland, but without all the rules. And he could start a new life there. He met a local girl, he fell in love, and then he proceeded to become really probably the #2 tick researcher in the world. And then at age 56 in 1982, he became a made man in science when he discovered the causative agent of Lyme disease, which is the Borrelia bacterium. And this is the Science magazine article that he published in, along with 5 other people were listed. But so that's the public-facing story. And then when that filmmaker's confession came around, you know, I decided I would dig deeper. And so at the time, Willie was suffering from advanced Parkinson's, which may or may not have been caused by Lyme disease that he got in about '83. So the first step I did is I went to the National Archives in Maryland, and Willy Burgdorfer's research papers, which had been archived by NIH, had just been released there. I requested them when I was doing the documentary, but it took about 4 years to process them. So I went to the archive and I dug through 33 boxes of Willy's immaculate, meticulously documented lab notes, letters, slides he took. And with the filmmaker, we went through them in about a week. And the interesting thing is there was nothing about his Lyme disease discovery and no letters from Alan Steer. So it was suspicious. It was like the thing I came there to investigate was missing. But in its place, there were slides and lots of lab notes about this thing called Swiss agent. And at that time, I knew nothing about what Swiss agent was. It turns out it's a rickettsia that he discovered it in Switzerland when he went on a sabbatical in '78, and that's that tie-in I'll explain later. So I went through the documents that I collected to try and understand the process of the discovery and to confirm find any clues about bioweapons. And I guess the first thing I did after I couldn't find any files is I went to see Willy Burgdorfer. And in that interview, that was in December of 2014, he was even more debilitated with Parkinson's, but what he said steeled my resolve to follow this to the end, and that was, he says, I was doing the things that the Nazis were doing. I was part of the biological weapons program. I worked in Fort Detrick, the headquarters. I was mass producing ticks. I was mixing multiple pathogens in ticks to make them weapons of war. There wasn't any evidence in the National Archive, but I had a lucky break because right after that, he called a Mormon BYU adjunct business professor, who was Ron Lindorf, and said, I want to submit the rest of my documents and lab notes of my precious research to an archive, probably BYU. Would you come and collect them? So Ron Lindorf knew I was writing this biography about Willy, and he said, do you want to come to Utah and look at them before we archive them? And I said, yes. And in 2 batches of those documents, it was enough to know there's a real story here, and an interesting one too. So this is a picture of Willy's garage. On the shelves are the history of the Ricketzel research program in the US during World War II. There were also his personal lab notes. So right now I'm just going to go through quickly the biological weapons program so you can understand the backdrop and why I think Willy was telling the truth. So the biological warfare program, established right after World War II, was as big as the Manhattan Project, and almost as big and as secretive. And this is an org chart of the biological weapons program in 1949. All these documents, by the way, are on my krisnewby.com website if you want to look at them, and also in the Utah Valley University archive. So what you see is Camp Detrick is the circle in the middle. They're sort of like the Medusa head of this large organization. And then all the armed forces, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, Army services, and at the very bottom are other government agencies, which included the US Public Health Service, which then became NIH, and that's where the Rocky Mountain Lab is under. And then Plum Island, which was under USDA, and they ran this sort of anti-animal bioweapons program. And then embedded within Fort Detrick, the biological warfare program, was a CIA group called Special Operations Divisions. And they did special projects. I'll explain one tick-borne project of theirs. But they did assassination things. They did the LSD program, the Manchurian Candidate, that are well publicized right now. And Willy, of course, was in Rocky Mountain Lab. He was a contractor for the biological weapons program in Detrick, and he would spend for about, I think, 5 years, he would spend months at a time there working on their special projects. Okay, you can't read this, but this is a CIA document on a CIA program to selectively breed Ixodes hard ticks. So these kind of documents scared the US government because they realized, reading the tea leaves, that Russia was developing insect-borne weapons, especially ticks. You know, in this particular experiment, they were selectively breeding hard ticks to make them reproduce faster so they could be used as weapons, and specifically breeding them so that they would be able to reproduce asexually like the longhorn tick, so that they would multiply and spread faster when dropped on enemies. So just within a few months, yes? Okay. Within a few months, Willy began on biological programs. He would get assignments from Detrick saying, can you make the ticks, breed faster? Can you mix like a rickettsial and a virus in the ticks to make a confusing presentation when we drop these ticks on enemies? He had a young family at home, but he was working on putting bubonic plague in fleas and trying to get them to live inside bomblets that would be dropped on the enemy. These bombs would reach a certain altitude and then explode and then would rain fleas down on a test field. And after this test, they released something like 600,000 fleas and 147 of them attached to the guinea pigs that were on the desert floor there. And they said they determined that that test was successful and that they would consider that as a long-term weapon. They also force-fed ticks with various disease elements. And in this one, Willie, so what these are ticks pressed into plasticine clay, glass pipettes full of disease agents, and he was trying to find the perfect mix of tick and disease agents so you could drop them from planes on the enemy such that the insect itself wouldn't call attention to itself, but the disease transmitted would, the population wouldn't have innate immunity, so they would get sick. They wouldn't be able to diagnose or test for it. And they did a lethal version of ticks and diseases and an incapacitating version so that it wouldn't call attention to the fact that they'd been hit. So it's sort of important on that to note that the diseases that were force-fed into the ticks, because it might inform physicians looking for the residual strains of this. So that was Q fever, tularemia, leptospira, and all three of the equine encephalitis viruses. He tried to put rabies in the ticks, but it wouldn't stick. After a while, they decided that mixing live insects and germs inside of them wasn't reliable enough for weapons, so they worked towards an aerosol program where they could spray mixes of viruses, bacteria, sometimes toxins, over whole cities. And in this case, they aerosolized Rickettsia rickettsii. So I have to emphasize that not all these things became weapons. They did lots and lots of experiments, sometimes open-air experiments, to see what would work best. And in the end, right before the program was canceled in 69, two of the go-to bioweapons were Rickettsia rickettsii and also Venezuelan equine encephalitis and, of course, tularemia. They also, of course, you couldn't make a bioweapon unless your own people were protected. So along with this came vaccine programs, and they had to experiment on animals and humans for this. This is the 8-ball at Fort Detrick in Maryland at the headquarters, and this is an airtight 1,000-liter sphere, and they would release aerosolized germs through those portholes and then put animals and humans inside and then have doctors monitor their health to see how fast the disease progressed in a healthy person versus a vaccinated person. My Detrick friend wanted me to tell you that no one died in the program. There's the 8-ball in its full glory. It's painted white. It's enclosed in a building. And mostly the volunteers were Seventh-day Adventists. They were conscientious objectors who didn't want to go to Vietnam or Korean War. Okay, to me, this is the perfect bioweapon tick. It's the Lone Star that you've heard a lot about. You know, it's the perfect tick because it's the only one in North America with eyes, so it doesn't just sit on a blade of grass. It can creep, it can swarm, it transmits rickettsias through its eggs and through all stages of the tick, so it spreads the disease faster. And of course, it's associated with alpha-gal meat allergies. So in the weapons program, the Army and the Atomic Energy Commission funded a series of open-air tests, uncontrolled releases of these ticks, and they made them radioactive so they could trace them with Geiger counters. So these tests began in '63, and they went through '69. In 1971, the first Lone Star tick was identified in Montauk, Long Island, which is, these were released in Virginia. It's on the Atlantic Bird Flyway, and it takes, the scientists who did this study determined that it takes 5 days for a bird to go from Virginia to Cape Cod. This just shows the the testing that they did. They took a 17-acre field, they marked it off into grids. They would release 1,000 ticks in each grid, and the radioactive ones, and then they would go out every month and see how far they had traveled, and they would collect those ticks, and then they would return them to the square where they were found. They were marked with colored paint. Okay, so, did this cause disease? Did this make the Lone Star outbreak worse? It's hard to say. We need epidemiological studies, but if you look at the sheer numbers of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, this is from one of Willie's reports, you can see that Rocky Mountain spotted fever dropped precipitously after antibiotics were available in '48, and then they spiked in 1969 after these open-air releases and at the height of the aerosol biological weapons program, and they've continued to rise. And then we have this crazy Lyme disease, which is still active, still a growing problem, growing. And so anyways, the story is, I wrote it like The Hot Zone. It's a narrative nonfiction. I wanted to make it a human-centric story. And I'll just go over briefly the findings. These are like novel information that no one's released before that are in the book, and they're well cited. So it's the U.S. Bioweapons Program ran a tick and tick-borne disease weaponization program from '50 through '69. And Willie Bergdorfer worked on many of these programs. Bergdorfer and Jim Oliver, who worked at Dietrich and later would go on to run our National Tick Library at Georgia Southern, they said they dropped infected. They worked on a project together to mass produce and figure out how to drop ticks on enemies. And I have a witness and supporting documentation that says we dropped infected ticks on Cuban sugarcane workers as part of the plots against Fidel Castro. There are probably other drops. It was a very secretive CIA project out of Dietrich. Okay, some of the tick-borne diseases experimented on for aerosolized releases included tularemia, the equine encephalitis viruses, and rickettsia. There were uncontrolled Army-funded releases of radioactive ticks in Virginia and Montana, and I told you about Long Island. Bergdorfer, who investigated the tick-borne outbreak around Long Island Sound in the mid-'70s, said in 2013 he thought the outbreak was initiated by a bioweapons incident, saying accidents happen, and he was told to keep it secret. He said he was threatened with deportation. I never found documentation of that. But I have to say, he never said Borrelia burgdorferi was the weapon. He thought it was a rickettsial mixed with Colorado tick fever virus because of combining those created, like I said, a confusing set of symptoms and a disease that couldn't be tested for, which is a lot like the mystery rickettsial, which I call in the book Swiss Agent USA, that it still hasn't been acknowledged or identified, and the only thing it tested for was the Swiss agent rickettsia that he found and claimed credit for in Europe, but never mentioned it after 1980 in any documentation. So the second batch of documents, which really detailed his bioweapons experiments in the 50s with Dietrich, had this sticky note on it that was written in Willie Bergdorfer's very characteristic handwriting. And whenever, I got to know his handwriting so well, and whenever he was writing about something important, he would get his red felt tip pen and write that part. So he'd be writing in blue, his scientific document, and then he'd switch to red saying, in conclusion, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, this was, I wondered why somebody didn't do something, and then I realized that I'm somebody. So it was almost like his confession note on top of these biological weapons documents where he really wanted to set the record straight. He ended up getting Lyme disease. He knew how serious it was. He saw the ravages of the disease over time as it spread across the United States. In my opinion, I think he wanted to clear the air before he died, because when I talked to him, he was 11 months from death. Okay, and then, this just shows the spread. It just keeps going like a wildfire, unrelenting. And then, part of my reason in coming forward with this is, first of all, we can learn from history, and I didn't wrap up everything in this book like an episode of Law and Order. there's still a lot of loose threads, but I went as far as I could go as a journalist and a science writer. And I just think there's some calls to action to the people in this room. So there may be epidemiologists, CDC, clinicians, and academic researchers. So here's my list of call to action is, is the condition we call chronic Lyme made worse or caused by an undiscovered co-infection, which may or may not be a bioweapon? And to researchers, now we have the genomic tools to really tell what is in the ticks. And CDC's already started doing that, like Kris in the Rickettsels division has been sequencing like a madman those genomes are coming to light and we're identifying new species. And recent evidence says that you can have in a tick multiple Rickettsel species, including rickettsia, and it causes a worse disease. So to epidemiologists, we've been, they've been saying, oh, it's, climate change and deer, human populations changing, but, I would say open your mind to another possibility that there's a human vector, in a military uniform that may have delivered different species in different places. Don't go by the normal rules of a natural spread of disease. To physicians, don't keep your mind open to other co-infections. So Dr. Liegner, who's in New York, he had a really unusual case, and he started looking at weird co-infections, and sure enough, he hit on tularemia, and because it's a known bioweapon, he had to report it to the government. So he immediately gets a call from CDC and says, well, has your patient worked in a bioweapons lab? And he goes, no, she's 16. So keep an open mind to the co-infections and be well-versed in their crazy symptoms if a normal course of doxycycline doesn't work. And then to patients, contact your congresspeople. I mean, my book got waved around by Congressman Kris Smith mid-July, and he said, this book is credible, there's interesting evidence, I think the military needs to follow up and tell us, did they weaponize ticks? Well, to me, yes, they did, but what I want to know is where and when and what they released, because that's just a lot cheaper than surveying every tick in every county. It'll save us money, and then we can get quicker to the cures. Also, we can open up the box of research that they did to protect their own soldiers, and if one of their germs had no known cure, as some of the Pentagon literature said, it's good to know that too. I would say with our new tools, we can probably find a cure now where we couldn't back then. And then the other thing is if you have any leads on people who worked on these programs, they're dying fast, let me know, because I'm trying to fill in the holes of the story. And then I'll just give you an update on the book. The press went wild after the congressional amendment added to the defense appropriation bill, because that's the biggest chunk of money on the planet that everybody wants a piece of. I don't know if it'll make it through Congress. It's a weird Congress, but with the military, I'd say if you broke it, you need to fix it now. And then, what I really hope about this book is it's already sort of broke the log jam about talking about the disease and raising awareness amongst people who don't know much about Lyme disease until they get it. So I'm heartened by that. And I just, so let's see what else is there anymore. Oh, I told you about, you can look on my website, Kris Newby, to look at some of these documents and images and the research papers. And then if you like the book, please put a review on Amazon, because I would say my book has been completely ignored by major media, and I think they need to read it. I mean, a lot of them are discounting it as conspiracy theory, but I just tried very hard to make everything fact-based, be very clear in the book about what I know and what I don't know, because I work in a scientific environment, and I just am hoping that I give new leads to scientists, new lines of inquiry, and I hope I launch 100 new PhD dissertations on epidemiology and genomics and new species. So that's it.